Okay, so here's the short form of my argument, and right after I'll give the long form to hopefully make things more clear. But basically, the argument, I think therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum, is valid but unsound. The knowledge that someone is making an argument and therefore thinking is only an observation. It's not true a priori. It's not necessary for someone to be making an argument for us to evaluate the argument. The fact that we can evaluate this argument does not imply that there is an arguer who exists to make the argument that we're evaluating. If we have to assume that we're thinking or making arguments from the start, we might as well just assume that we exist, since they're both equally observable. Thus, the argument is not only unsound but superfluous. It doesn't actually tell us anything we didn't already know. So on the screen is the original text translated from French into English, and you can pause to read it if you want. But he's really just making the very basic philosophical point that observations don't necessarily convey truth. And he gave the example that when he's awake, his observations might be as fictitious as they would be if he were dreaming. And then he came to the conclusion that, but to make these observations at all, even if they are fictitious, he must exist in the first place to make the observations. So that's where he's coming from, and my argument seeks to sort of demonstrate that his argument isn't that meaningful. So the long form of that argument, which might be much more clear to most people, is that the argument, I think therefore I am, aka cogito ergo sum, is valid but unsound, which means that the argument is true if the assumptions it makes are true, but the assumptions are not necessarily true. This is the case because the argument makes the assumption of I think, or cogito, which could mean just thought is occurring, or maybe that's not true technically in Latin. Either way, it doesn't even matter. Either way, that is something which is not known a priori, meaning it's not something we know before making observations. It can't be concluded from reason alone. If we had argued and said, if I think, then I am, it would be sound because we've made the argument conditional upon I think being true, but we haven't just assumed it is. So you might be thinking, that's not an assumption because to make the argument, you must be thinking. And you're right if we're talking about a person making an argument, but we're actually evaluating an argument. We're not evaluating an arguer making an argument. Put another way, we're not evaluating the argument if someone argues, I think therefore I am, then they exist. We're just evaluating I think therefore I am by itself. If we were assuming that there's an arguer making the argument, we've already assumed they exist. So what's the point of even making the argument? We just assumed the conclusion from the start. To be clear, an argument can exist intellectually without an arguer. It's not necessary for someone to make an argument for us to evaluate that argument. Arguments are not intrinsically linked to the person making them. Arguments are simply a way of reorganizing information. For example, the argument 2 + 2 = 4 would evaluate to true whether someone makes it or not, simply because of how we define the terms. So the point is this: you actually gain nothing from cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am, as an argument. Yes, if you are making an argument, then you must exist, but you must assume you're making an argument in the first place. If you can just assume you're making an argument, why not just assume you exist? They're both equally observable. It's just as good to say, I exist, therefore I exist. That is equally meaningful as saying, I think, therefore I exist. In truth, it's not possible to prove that you exist or are thinking without some assumptions. For example, my observations represent the truth, or this argument is being made by me. If you assumed those, then you could prove that you exist. But if you don't make any assumptions, you can't prove anything deductively. You would have to make observations and just assume your observations are correct.